When we think about how societies are best governed, our minds often jump straight to elections, individual rights. That whole idea that power should really be with the people.
Right. It's the default setting for many of us.
But what if there's a recent, pretty compelling analysis that kind of flips that conventional wisdom on its head? What if it suggests a different path to maybe stability and national strength?
It's a truly fascinating question, actually, and it's precisely what we're digging into today. We're pulling back the curtain on two, well, ancient, yet still incredibly relevant forms of governance: monarchies and democracies.
Okay, so our deep dive today is all about unpacking this comparative analysis. And it makes some pretty surprising claims. It suggests that monarchies, especially the constitutional kind, might actually offer superior long-term stability.
And continuity, yeah.
Yeah.
Plus a unifying national identity. The report argues this could lead to more consistent policy and ultimately greater national resilience.
So our mission here is to guide you through the core arguments, the key insights from this analysis. We'll explore the strengths, the weaknesses of each system across several areas.
And just to be clear, we're not here to take sides, not at all. We're simply laying out what this particular report tells us, helping you distill some genuinely surprising facts, and hopefully a few aha moments along the way.
Okay, sounds good. So let's set the stage. Let's define what we actually mean by these two very different systems. When we talk about a monarchy, what's its defining characteristic?
Well, at its heart, a monarchy is a system where the head of state inherits their office, typically for life, often through a family line, a dynasty.
That hereditary part is key, isn't it?
It's absolutely crucial because it bypasses elections, right?
Yeah.
It creates this unchallenged sort of built-in continuity of leadership. It's perfectly summed up in that famous phrase, "The king is dead, long live the king."
The transition is instant.
Exactly. Immediate, seamless, no power vacuum.
And it's not just one type of monarchy, is it? The report mentions different ways that power actually plays out.
You're right. The analysis highlights a few key types. You've got absolute monarchy, where the monarch holds supreme, basically unchecked power. Think Brunei or Saudi Arabia today.
Okay.
Then there's the constitutional monarchy. This is the most common modern form. Here, the monarch's power is legally limited by a constitution, and it's shared with an elected parliament.
So their role is more symbolic.
Primarily symbolic and ceremonial, yeah.
Yeah.
Serving as a unifying head of state. The UK, Japan, Canada, those are classic examples.
I've also heard of mixed or semi-constitutional types mentioned, like Jordan, perhaps.
Indeed, Jordan fits that mixed category. The monarch there retains more executive authority than in a purely ceremonial constitutional monarchy.
And what about the less common elective monarchy? How does that work?
Right, elective monarchy is where monarchs are actually chosen, elected for a term or for life, rather than just inheriting the position. You see this in places like Cambodia or Malaysia's really unique federal system.
Malaysia's system, where the state rulers elect the national king.
Exactly. The state royal leaders elect the federal monarch, the Yang di-Pertuan Agong, every 5 years. It's quite a distinctive setup.
So, beyond just inheritance, what are the fundamental principles that this report emphasizes about monarchy?
Right.
What makes it tick, according to the analysis?
Well, beyond that hereditary succession, which, clearly ensures uninterrupted leadership, the analysis really hammers home the idea of continuity and stability. A monarch provides this constant, enduring figurehead.
Which can be valuable when governments change frequently.
Hugely valuable. It can be a massive source of political stability, especially when prime ministers and cabinets are constantly shifting. But what's also fascinating is their role as a symbolic, unifying focal point.
How so?
Because they're supposed to be above partisan politics, they can embody national identity, heritage. This contributes significantly to what people call soft power, a country's ability to influence others through culture and values, not force.
Especially useful in diverse societies, I imagine.
Absolutely vital, yeah. And historically, of course, many monarchies also claimed divine right, linking the monarch to some kind of higher spiritual authority, though that's less common now.
And there's a really interesting point the report makes about constitutional monarchies, almost a paradox, isn't there?
Yes, absolutely. It suggests that a constitutional monarch, by giving up direct political power, paradoxically enhances the stability of the institution itself.
How does that work?
Their role shifts. They move from being a political player to being an apolitical, enduring symbol. So the report implies that the real strength of a modern monarchy isn't wielding absolute power, but its kind of uncanny ability to float above the political battles, providing that stable anchor for national identity.
It's quite remarkable how the institution adapted.
It really is. Adapting to integrate democratic principles rather than just being swept away by them, it shows a surprising resilience.
Okay, that's a great point about adaptation.
Mm.
So if that's monarchy, let's flip to the other side. What's the core concept behind democracy?
In essence, democracy is fundamentally about power being vested in the people. The foundational principle is that the will of the people is the source of legitimacy of sovereign states.
Right.
It's built on ideas of individual autonomy, people having control over their own lives and equality, aiming to ensure everyone has, ideally, an equal say in how society is run.
And just like monarchies, democracies aren't all the same, are they? We see different models out there.
That's right. The purest form, maybe the ideal, is direct democracy. Think ancient Athens, where citizens directly voted on laws.
Practical for a small city-state, maybe?
Exactly. But the report notes it quickly becomes impractical for larger populations. Think about voter fatigue, the sheer complexity of modern laws.
So most countries use representative democracy instead.
Right. Representative democracy is the most common form today. Citizens elect representatives, members of parliament, congresspeople, presidents to make decisions on their behalf. It's seen as more efficient and scalable.
And within representative democracy, we have different structures, like parliamentary and presidential systems.
Precisely. In a parliamentary democracy, like the UK's Westminster system, the executive branch, usually led by a prime minister, comes from and answers to the legislature.
Okay.
In a presidential democracy, like the US, the head of government, the president, leads a separate executive branch, distinct from the legislature. Different checks and balances apply.
The report mentions other forms too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Less common ones.
Yeah, it acknowledges other variations, like liberal democracies, ethnic democracies, and so on. But those parliamentary and presidential models are the main structural differences we focus on.
So what are the bedrock principles of democracy that the report really highlights? What's non-negotiable?
Well, key principles include popular sovereignty, that ultimate government authority rests with the people. Then, absolutely central are human rights and freedoms. Freedom of thought, expression, assembly, protection from discrimination.
And the rule of law.
Non-negotiable. Everyone, including those in power, is subject to the law. You need an independent judiciary to uphold that. Plus, periodic free and fair elections, a clear separation of powers providing checks and balances, and, ideally, transparency and accountability from the government to the people.
But despite these really noble ideals, the report isn't shy about pointing out where democracy often, well, falls short in the real world.
And that's where the analysis gets really incisive. While the principles are aspirational, real-world implementation often struggles, that will of the people idea can get diluted by things like surprisingly low voter turnout, for instance, or it can be manipulated by misinformation, especially now. And then there's this concept of elite capture.
What's that exactly?
It's where the very mechanisms meant to help participation, like, say, election financing or lobbying, can ironically be used by wealthy interests to gain disproportionate influence. So policy might end up serving a narrow group rather than the broader public. Plus, political systems, especially presidential ones, can just become frustratingly inefficient because of legislative gridlock. Things just don't get done.
So there's a gap between the promise and the reality.
Persistent gap, yeah. The report suggests the necessary shift from direct to representative democracy also creates a kind of representation gap. Citizens give up some direct control, which can lead to feelings of disconnection, a sense that the system serves elites, not them.
It really puts things in perspective. It's all about that historical context too, isn't it? How did these systems actually evolve? And what does that tell us when we compare their core characteristics?
Oh, absolutely. Historically, monarchies were, dominant pretty much everywhere right up until the 20th century. Early European monarchs, for example, gradually shifted from ruling people to ruling defined territories. They centralized immense power.
Like Louis XIV, the Sun King.
The classic example of absolutism, yeah. But then a key turning point was the reaction against that kind of absolute power. This often led to constitutional limits, the rise of parliaments, especially in places like the UK. Many modern monarchies adapted, shifting to purely symbolic roles to survive.
And democracy's core ideas emerged as a direct response to that concentrated power, right?
Exactly. You see the seeds in ancient Greece and Rome with different levels of citizen participation. Then key documents like Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights, they laid groundwork for limiting monarchical power.
And then a bigger shift after World War II.
A massive shift, a widespread democratic revolution, you could call it, as many new nations embraced popular sovereignty.
Okay, and here's where it gets really interesting and maybe a bit counterintuitive based on what we usually think. The report emphasizes that some countries actually developed strong democratic systems while keeping their monarchs. How did that happen?
Yeah, this is a real deep dive moment in the analysis. Constitutional monarchies are often presented as this remarkably successful compromise, a way to blend tradition with modernity.
So it wasn't always revolution versus monarchy.
Not always. The report suggests that when monarchies failed to meet changing societal needs, or faced huge external pressures like losing a war, that's when revolutions often drove the transition to republics. Think France, Russia, China.
Okay.
But for others, the key was adaptation. The ability to essentially give up direct political power but retain that symbolic unity, that was crucial for their survival and the peaceful integration of democratic principles. It implies a system's survival isn't just about its design, but its ability to evolve, resilience.
That's a fascinating perspective. So if we step back and look at the big picture, how did the core characteristics of monarchies and democracies actually stack up against each other based on this analysis?
The report lays out a really stark comparison. Let's run through it. For head of state, it's hereditary in a monarchy versus elected in a democracy. Simple enough.
Right.
Source of authority, tradition, maybe divine right historically for monarchy versus the will of the people or a constitution for democracy. Succession, hereditary versus elections.
Accountability seems like a big difference.
Huge. It ranges from limited, maybe none, in absolute monarchies to constitutionally defined in others. But in democracies, it's generally high, at least in theory, to the electorate.
What about decision-making speed?
Can be very fast in absolute monarchies as one person decides. In democracies, it's often slower, more deliberative. You have debate, negotiation, and that higher potential for gridlock we mentioned.
And the time horizon for policy focus, that seems critical based on what you said earlier.
Absolutely crucial, yeah. Monarchies, thinking about the dynasty, tend to operate with a much longer-term perspective, generations even. Democracies, often a shorter-term focus, driven heavily by those electoral cycles.
Next election is always looming.
Always. Then, national unity role. A monarch aims to be a unifying symbol above politics. Democracies, well, they're often divided by partisanship. It's kind of baked into the system.
And checks and balances.
Limited or non-existent in absolute monarchies. Strong, usually enshrined through separation of powers in democracies.
So boiling it all down, what's the big takeaway from this comparative overview in the report?
The key takeaway seems to be this tension. While democracy champions dispersed power, which sounds inherently good, it can paradoxically lead to gridlock, inefficiency. The report suggests that monarchies' perceived efficiency coming from more centralized power still holds a strong appeal in certain situations or for certain goals.
And external shocks play a big role.
A critical role. The report really underlines that major shocks, wars, economic collapse, widespread social unrest have historically been the catalyst for transforming these systems, often leading to the downfall of monarchies that just couldn't adapt quickly enough.
Okay, let's really dig into the comparative analysis now, domain by domain, starting with social justice and equity. What are monarchies' inherent challenges here, according to the report?
Well, monarchy, especially the absolute kind, faces a pretty significant challenge just because of its inherent inequality. The head of state gets the job by birth, right? Not merit, not election.
Which creates inequality from the start.
Exactly. And there's often no clear public accountability for the monarch. That hereditary principle can, just by its design, perpetuate disparities. Royal families often hold immense wealth, sometimes without much democratic oversight.
And historically, there were real risks.
Absolutely. In absolute monarchies, common people could historically be denied basic rights, and the risk of tyranny is a critical concern. When monarchs rule without public input, the potential for corruption, for abuse of power, increases. The report mentions King Leopold II of Belgium.
In the Congo Free State.
Yes, a truly horrific example cited of the profound abuses possible when you have unchecked power and zero accountability.
But the report also finds some, maybe unexpected potential for monarchy in this area, almost a counterintuitive point.
It does find some, yes. Despite those inherent power imbalances, there are historical examples of what are sometimes called enlightened despots.
Enlightened despots.
Yeah, monarchs who were often inspired by Enlightenment ideals and actually pursued significant legal, social, educational reforms from the top down. Maria Theresa in Austria, for instance, she introduced basic education, new farming techniques to try and lift up her people.
Joseph II as well?
Joseph II, her son, extended legal freedom to serfs. Even going way back, Cyrus of Persia is noted for early declarations on tolerance and human rights.
So top-down reform could be quick.
Potentially very quick, and the report notes that even in some contemporary absolute monarchies, ruling families have maintained stability partly by actively mollifying dissenting opinions through distributing wealth or providing services. It's definitely a complex picture.
Okay, so democracy, on the other hand,
Yeah.
seems to have social justice and equality built right into its DNA, doesn't it?
Yeah. That's certainly its moral strength, its core promise. It's fundamentally built on individual autonomy and equality. It provides an environment that, at least in theory, respects human rights and fundamental freedoms for everyone.
And modern social justice movements are tied to democracy.
Deeply intertwined, yes. Democratic ideals emphasize breaking down systemic barriers, creating safety nets, ensuring equitable access to things like education and healthcare. Decision makers are, in principle, held accountable through elections. Laws are transparent.
And there are tools for redistribution.
Right. Legislative tools like progressive taxation, minimum wage laws, they're explicitly designed to try and redistribute wealth and foster greater equity.
But as the report indicates, democracy faces some pretty significant hurdles in actually delivering on that promise of equity consistently.
It's true. Despite having the policies on paper, pervasive inequalities related to class, race, income, they can persist, or sometimes even deepen.
Why is that?
Well, achieving comprehensive social justice often requires what the report calls a whole-of-government approach. And that's incredibly difficult in many democracies because of political divisions, those short electoral cycles that discourage long-term planning, and just plain old entrenched bureaucracy.
And that elite capture idea comes back in.
It does. Democracies are seen as susceptible to it. The wealthy can disproportionately influence policy through campaign finance, lobbying, bending the system to their interests. And of course, there's always the potential concern of the tyranny of the majority, where a majority might vote to disregard the rights or needs of minority groups.
So it's a fascinating tension again. Democracy offers this powerful framework, this aspiration for justice.
If the framework is powerful, the commitment is there.
But it struggles with consistent, rapid implementation.
Precisely. The report highlights that struggle. Conversely, think about that truly benevolent, absolute monarch, a rare figure, admittedly, but they could, theoretically, implement widespread social reforms with remarkable speed and efficiency. Why? Because they have unchecked power. They're not constrained by electoral pressures or legislative gridlock.
The benevolent despot.
It's a rare but historically impactful phenomenon that democracies, just by their nature, with their checks and balances and short-term political incentives, really struggle to replicate. It's a powerful point about the trade-off between speed and broad-based consent.
Let's shift gears then to social mobility and opportunity. Historically, monarchies seem like they would have been pretty rigid when it came to moving up the social ladder.
That's putting it mildly. Historically, monarchical societies were often characterized by deeply entrenched class structures. Think Elizabethan England. Your birth pretty much dictated your social standing, what clothes you could wear, even your job.
Monarchs reinforced that.
Actively reinforced it, yeah. Through things like sumptuary laws, patronage systems. The core principle of hereditary succession right at the very top inherently contradicts the ideal of merit-based social mobility for everyone else. Wealth tended to stay concentrated, which severely hindered broader advancement.
Were there any cracks in that system? Any nuances or exceptions the report found?
A few, yes, some limited examples. For instance, in pre-revolutionary France, wealthy commoners could sometimes actually buy patents of nobility, essentially buying their way into the aristocracy.
Interesting.
And monarchs could sometimes foster innovation through patronage. Pedro II of Brazil, for example, encouraged coffee production and infrastructure development that indirectly opened some avenues for economic and thus social movement. But these were generally the exceptions that proved the rule of rigidity.
Democracy, on the other hand, explicitly aims for a meritocracy, right? For greater social mobility.
It absolutely does. Democracy aims to design policies that foster equality, promote sustainable economic growth, partly through enhancing social mobility. Societies with robust democratic institutions tend, on average, to perform better in offering opportunities to disadvantaged groups.
through things like education.
Exactly. Emphasizing equal access to quality education, decent employment opportunities. Democratic governments use legislative frameworks, public investment, progressive taxation to try and level the playing field. It embraces that human capital theory investing in education is a direct path to upward mobility. Newer technologies are sometimes seen as potential drivers for bridging inequalities, too.
But again, the report suggests there are still significant barriers for democracies in actually achieving that promised mobility in practice.
Absolutely. Despite policies designed to promote it, systemic barriers can persistently get in the way. High levels of income inequality, for instance, are often a strong signal of limited mobility, suggesting the playing field isn't truly level, regardless of policies.
And technology can be a double-edged sword.
It can be. New tech like AI, while maybe boosting overall productivity, also risks job stability for many people. That could potentially worsen downward mobility for some. And the report points out, surprisingly perhaps, that the U.S., often seen as the land of opportunity, has actually seen constrained social mobility in recent decades.
So another tension between the democratic aspiration and the real-world results here.
Definitely. While democracy aspires to be a meritocracy, real-world democracies often grapple with entrenched inequalities, wealth concentration things that directly limit mobility. And what's truly intriguing is a suggestion in the report.
What's that?
It suggests that if the middle class perceives a high risk of downward mobility, of falling down the ladder, they might paradoxically start to prefer an autocratic regime if they think it offers greater stability, even if that regime initially means less economic redistribution.
Wow, that really challenges the simple idea that social mobility always strengthens democracy.
It does. It suggests perceived stability can sometimes trump the desire for upward mobility, which is a very counterintuitive finding.
Okay, let's turn to economic stability and prosperity then. What's monarchy's strength in this domain, according to the report? This seems like a potential strong suit.
It really does seem to be where monarchy shines in this particular analysis. Dynastic monarchies, just by their nature, tend to adopt a far longer-term view of their national economies.
Because they're thinking generations ahead.
Exactly. They're thinking about the dynasty, the long haul. This fosters more far-sighted policies, makes them less susceptible to the short-term populism that can really plague elected governments focused on the next election. That extended time horizon means they can prioritize generational investments.
And that affects things like property rights.
It leads to better protection of property rights, typically, which is crucial for long-term investment. And interestingly, many contemporary constitutional monarchies are, in fact, among the richest and most equitable countries globally.
Why is that, according to the report?
They provide a predictable climate that encourages investment. And the monarch, even a symbolic one, can act as a crucial sort of brake on the boundless ambition of politicians, as the report puts it, a stabilizing influence.
Even credit ratings agencies notice.
Apparently so. Independent rating agencies have even noted stronger credit scores for monarchies, which signals greater market confidence in their fiscal stability.
But I'm guessing there are still economic drawbacks to monarchies mentioned. It can't all be positive, surely.
No, definitely not all positive. Critics, and the report acknowledges this, argue that monarchy can worsen unequal wealth distribution, with royal families accumulating vast fortunes.
And lack of accountability.
Without sufficient checks and balances, monarchs might prioritize personal gain or undertake ill-conceived, costly projects. The report hints this contributed to the economic decline of the Russian Empire, for example. And while stability is a benefit, it can become a hindrance to growth if the monarchy resists necessary economic change. Plus, of course, the financial burden of maintaining a royal family can be significant for taxpayers.
Okay. And what about democracy's economic benefits? It's often sold as the best path to prosperity for the most people.
Empirically, democracy is associated with some good things. Higher human capital accumulation, lower inflation generally, reduced political instability compared to unstable autocracies, and greater economic freedom. The report notes that poor democracies have, on average, grown their economies significantly faster, maybe 50% more rapidly than non-democracies over the last 45 years or so.
Are there specific examples?
Countries like Botswana, Costa Rica are often cited as examples of democracies that achieved strong growth. And concepts like worker cooperatives also fit within a democratic framework, aiming to broaden ownership and distribute economic benefits more widely.
But the report points to a clear, fundamental weakness for democracies economically. This idea of short-termism. How does that actually play out?
This seems to be a major Achilles heel for democracies in the report's view. Because of those fixed electoral cycles, politicians often struggle to focus on truly long-term problems, like chronic underinvestment in things that boost long-term productivity or crucial infrastructure. There's also pain aversion.
Pain aversion.
Politicians avoiding necessary short-term sacrifices, like raising taxes for a long-term project, or cutting popular but inefficient programs simply to keep voters happy and win the next election. This often results in, say, inefficient subsidies rather than critical long-term investments in public goods.
And other democratic vulnerabilities.
Democracies are also seen as highly susceptible to that elite capture we talked about, divisive elections creating uncertainty, and legislative gridlock, all of which can paralyze economic decision-making.
So the contrast here is really stark. Generational planning versus thinking about the next election cycle.
It truly is. The report highlights monarchy's distinct advantage in economic policy specifically because of its long-term focus. It allows for generational investments over short electoral cycles. This stands in sharp contrast to the short-termism seen as prevalent in democracies, where that fixation on immediate voter satisfaction often crowds out vital long-term planning.
And the symbolic stability matters too.
Yes. The symbolic stability of a monarch can significantly influence economic confidence, attract investment. An apolitical head of state, in this view, acts as a check on purely political ambition, contributing to a more stable environment for economic planning that extends beyond any single government's term in office.
Okay, let's talk about infrastructure development next. How do monarchies stack up here, especially given that long-term view you just mentioned?
Well, monarchies, particularly those with that long-term dynastic perspective, can offer significant advantages for big infrastructure projects. Unburdened by re-election pressures, monarchs are potentially uniquely positioned to plan and implement extensive development projects that might span decades, even generations.
That long-term vision is key.
Absolutely crucial for large-scale infrastructure. And historically, monarchs often directly patronize major engineering feats. Think Henry VIII's huge shipbuilding programs in England.
Or Queen Victoria and the Industrial Revolution.
Exactly. Queen Victoria's support for the great engineering projects of that era, or even something immense like the Great Wall of China, seen as a testament to centralized authority's ability to mobilize resources for a massive long-term project. That centralized authority can also streamline decision-making, allowing for incredibly swift action sometimes.
But I'm guessing that kind of centralized power comes with its own set of risks, especially when you're talking about huge, expensive projects.
It definitely does. Absolute monarchs with their unchecked power might undertake what the report terms megalomaniac projects, things that prioritize personal grandeur or monument building over genuine national need, that could potentially misallocate vast resources.
Interruption risk.
Of course. The lack of public accountability in such systems significantly increases the risk of corruption. There's just less scrutiny over how massive sums of money are being spent on these mega projects.
So how does democracy fare with infrastructure development, given its challenges with long-term planning and potential gridlock?
Democracies face some unique hurdles here, for sure. That short-termism we keep coming back to, driven by electoral cycles, often leads to chronic underinvestment in long-term public goods like infrastructure. Things that don't pay off before the next election get pushed aside.
And gridlock doesn't help.
Political gridlock, especially in presidential systems, can significantly slow or even halt critical projects. Plus, complex regulations, while often necessary, can also complicate initiatives, leading to delays and cost overruns.
Are there benefits to the democratic approach, though?
Yes, on the plus side, democracies do tend to promote a strong public role. They emphasize open communication, accessible information, and participatory decision-making. Theoretically, this allows citizens to influence which projects get built and how.
And there are successes.
Oh, absolutely. Historical examples like the massive expansion of U.S. railroads or the development of the national electricity grid show how democratic processes can lead to widespread, transformative infrastructure development, albeit perhaps with more debate and sometimes slower starts than an absolute ruler might achieve.
So the contrast, again, seems to be about time horizons and decision-making efficiency, almost a trade-off between speed and participation.
Exactly. The report argues that monarchy's long-term vision and inherent continuity offer a significant advantage for those really large-scale, multi-generational infrastructure projects compared to the short-term focus and often partisan politics in democracies.
Yeah.
That centralized authority, for better or worse, can lead to more efficient and decisive execution, often bypassing the bureaucratic hurdles and political squabbling that can plague democratic infrastructure initiatives.
Okay, finally, let's explore foreign affairs and international relations. What's monarchy's particular strength in this arena, according to the analysis?
Monarchies often provide significant benefits in foreign affairs, primarily because of their inherent continuity.
Yeah.
A monarch's lifelong tenure means they can ensure a stable foreign policy, one that's largely uninfluenced by the frequent leadership shifts and partisan politics so common in democracies.
So consistency is key.
Consistency allows for the cultivation of truly long-term diplomatic strategies and enduring international relationships. Monarchs can also serve as neutral, apolitical figures. This fosters significant soft power.
How does that work?
They act as consistent diplomatic figures, goodwill ambassadors. They can project a stable and unified national image internationally. King Abdullah II of Jordan is often cited as an example of this. Because they're positioned above the day-to-day political fray, they can, in theory, prioritize long-term national interest over short-term political gains or electoral calculations.
But there are also inherent risks, especially with absolute monarchs in foreign policy. Their decisions could be completely unchecked, right?
Precisely. That's the downside. Absolute monarchs with their unchecked power could pursue what political scientists call diversionary foreign policies.
Like starting a war to distract from problems at home.
Exactly. Essentially, starting conflicts abroad to distract from domestic unrest. The report mentions King Henry V's invasion of France as a possible historical example. Their personal whims or ambitions could dictate foreign policy without any real accountability, leading to unpredictable or even disastrous outcomes for the nation. No checks, no balances.
And for democracies, what are the main foreign policy challenges the report identifies?
Well, frequent policy shifts are a common issue. A new administration comes in, reverses or significantly alters the foreign policy stances of the previous one. That can certainly impact international credibility, create uncertainty for allies and adversaries alike.
Internal politics can interfere too.
Internal political divisions can definitely undermine a unified foreign policy, making it difficult for a democracy to speak with one clear voice on the global stage. Democracies can also struggle with credibility issues sometimes, particularly if they appear to apply different human rights standards to strategic partners versus countries they oppose.
And short-termism again.
And that familiar short-termism, due to electoral cycles, also plagues foreign policy decisions, sometimes prioritizing immediate public approval or a quick diplomatic win over potentially more beneficial but less popular long-term strategies.
But democracies also have clear benefits in international relations, don't they? I mean, the democratic peace theory comes to mind.
They absolutely do, and the report acknowledges this. Democratic peace theory is a major point, the idea that democracies are significantly less likely to engage in war with other democracies. That suggests a powerful pacifying effect in international relations if democracy spreads.
Yeah, promoting values.
Right. Democracies also tend to advocate strongly for human rights and fundamental freedoms globally. They often use various diplomatic and economic tools to promote these values worldwide, creating networks of like-minded nations.
So wrapping up this section, the continuity of a monarch versus the often shifting policies of a democracy, that seems to be the core contrast highlighted in the report.
Precisely. The report emphasizes monarchy's continuity and long-term perspective as a significant potential advantage over the often shifting, sometimes short-term focused democratic foreign policies. It allows for cultivating those enduring diplomatic relationships.
And the monarch as a symbol matters internationally, too.
Yes, a monarch as a neutral, unifying symbol can project a more cohesive and stable national image internationally. This enhances soft power and consistency. They can engage in high-level diplomacy without being quite so constrained by domestic political divisions or needing to constantly cater to specific voter bases, offering a different kind of diplomatic leverage than an elected leader might have.
Okay, so as this deep dive has really revealed, the comparative analysis we've been exploring makes some truly compelling arguments for the enduring relevance and, maybe in some critical aspects, the distinct advantages of monarchical governance, particularly in its constitutional form.
Yeah, it definitely challenges some common assumptions. While democratic ideals are undeniably laudable, something we deeply value, the report suggests their practical implementation often faces pretty significant limitations in the real world.
So boiling down the arguments for monarchy from this report, what are the absolute key takeaways?
Well, the report emphasizes that monarchy's core strength really lies in its potential for unparalleled stability and continuity. providing that unwavering anchor for the nation.
which helps with the long-term vision.
Exactly. It fosters that crucial long-term vision across economic policy, infrastructure development, foreign affairs. Unlike democratic leaders often tied to short electoral cycles, a monarch, just by design, can potentially prioritize those generational investments.
And what really stands out, too, is that role the monarch can play as a powerful, neutral, unifying force for national identity, social cohesion, really remaining above the political battles and embodying a collective spirit.
Right. And that extends to projecting a stable national image internationally, which, as we discussed, can be invaluable for diplomacy and soft power.
And even though absolute monarchies have clear risks,
Big risks, yes, due to unchecked power.
the report does point to historical examples showing their capacity for potentially rapid and sweeping social reforms, precisely because they weren't constrained by legislative gridlock or electoral pressures.
It's that speed versus consensus trade-off again. So the report seems to conclude that while democracies offer the vital promise of popular participation and accountability, their inherent challenges, short-termism, political fragmentation, susceptibility to internal divisions, often impede steady, long-term progress and stability.
And it suggests that the very presence of an apolitical hereditary head of state can actually act as a vital stabilizing check. A check on the ambitions of politicians, ensuring a kind of foundational stability that, this report argues, ultimately benefits the nation more profoundly in the long run.
It's a provocative conclusion, definitely. It positions the monarch not just as a symbol, but as a functional component enhancing long-term governance.
So, a final thought for you, our listeners. When you consider the enduring well-being, the resilience of a nation, based on everything we've unpacked today, what stands out most to you from this rather unexpected comparison? Something to mull over.